This is the fourth video looking at the possible impacts from climate change. In this video, we're going to think about how climate change is an environmental justice issue. So how do the impacts of climate change fall disproportionately on people of color, ethnic minorities, religious minorities, or vulnerable populations, anybody with a lower socioeconomic status. So our social impacts, the effects of climate change will have a disproportionate impact on communities of color and low-income communities. And this was a finding from the IPCC report. So it's not just something that is sort of coming out of logic. It's something that is coming out of scientific investigation, that these impacts that we expect are going to be disproportionately felt and are already being disproportionately felt by our most vulnerable populations. The first impact we'll look at is desertification and the loss of arable land. Poor countries tend to also be hotter countries. Crops and livestock in these areas are already at their upper temperature limits. So things like plants and animals that we would expect their ranges to be shifting, they are going to be shifting away from these areas. It will become more difficult to have food sources in a lot of these poor countries. Increased evaporation, and therefore the severity of the drought, because if we have water present and it's evaporating, we're going to have less water present, is going to make agriculture more difficult. So in places where we have a lot of poor people, we're also going to be experiencing difficulties in growing food. The term desertification is the transition of an area into an increasingly more dry, arid state. So we are turning something that maybe where plants could have grown into more of a desert, desertification. This can be caused by a few different things. The first one we'll look at is agricultural exploitation. So for example, if you have maybe even a tropical forest or something kind of at the edge of a tropical forest, so in the subtropical zone, maybe in that region that's going to border somewhere that's already a desert into our tropical area. So between there, we remove that forest, we burn it because we need to grow crops in that place. So we have to be continuously adding water. We wouldn't have to do that if we're in a fully tropical area because there's always water being added by the atmosphere. But if we're adding water, then we are going to be removing a lot of nutrients because they get dissolved into that water as it runs off. And then we get a buildup of salts in the soil, particularly if we're adding fertilizers. We get a loss of the nutrients and we get a loss of the water holding capability of that soil by changing its chemistry and changing its structure. So over time, that can lead to an inability of plants to be able to grow there, particularly if you stop putting in inputs of water and fertilizer. So something that might have been a semi-productive forest can be converted into a desert landscape just by this kind of sequential agricultural exploitation over time. Another common cause of desertification is water diversion. So this is the Aral Sea. It used to be the fourth largest inland sea. And so you can see this change over time. It starts in 1977. Oh, and you can't see it because it's underneath my face, but it just gets a little bit smaller. So here, this last one you can see is in June 2009. So in the, I think it was 1950s, there were some major rivers that were going into the Aral Sea, and that was the input of water into this inland sea. So precipitation, but there's not much precipitation in the area that it's in. And then these water sources that are rivers coming from snowmelt. So those rivers get diverted for agricultural purposes, and we lose the input of new water to the Aral Sea. And most of what we get is just evaporation of the water that's already there because it's in a hot area. So over time, salt concentration increases because we have less water and relatively more salt, and we get smaller body of water that's being acted on more strongly because it's more shallow, right? So it's going to be warming up, so we get more evaporation and then more evaporation, and now the Aral Sea doesn't even exist at all. It's two separate sea regions, and the rest of this area is incredibly salty soil. And that salt, as the water dries, you just get dry kind of salt crust sitting on the soil, and that can get picked up by the winds and get deposited onto any crops that are growing nearby, or even just natural plants, right? They don't have to be crops, and kill those plants because they're not adapted to that salt tolerance. So another type of desertification can be in these changes in climate toward drier, warmer conditions. So maybe we don't have a change in the land use in that area, but we have changed our overall global climate. We've changed our ocean currents and our air currents and how they function, and now we get this longer dry season that leads to this desertification because plants can no longer survive there. So we're currently losing about 12 million hectares of land per year to desertification from all of these different causes. Another impact that is going to be disproportionately more on our vulnerable communities is disappearing islands and shorelines. So in the coming years, many people and communities will be forced to leave their coastal homes. And if we look at who lives on the coast, at least in the United States, the 2000 census looked at all of this demographic information. So you can take that demographic information and look at where those people live and their socioeconomic status. And this rated how vulnerable these different populations are. You can see that a lot of people who live on the coast, particularly here on the west coast and down in the Gulf of Mexico area, we have a lot of vulnerable populations present on the coast. And those people may be forced to leave their homes as sea level rises. But will they be able to, right? So we saw that with Hurricane Katrina, that a lot of people were not able to leave the area or to react appropriately to preserve their lives, preserve their income, and we had a lot of death and a lot of unnecessary social impacts on those people because they were vulnerable and they couldn't leave. Currently, islands in the Pacific are already starting to disappear. So we have coastal communities that have to move because their homes are going to be covered in water, or maybe there's going to be some other impact from that rising sea level that makes their home inaccessible, right? And so island populations can't just move inland if it's too small of an island. There's nowhere to go. So much like the Pika, these people who live on smaller islands are going to have to vacate those islands. And whether they can do that or not, or whether they want to do that, is going to differ from population to population. So this is imagery from the Solomon Islands. They're located off the coast of Australia and Papua New Guinea. Recently, 5 of the uninhabited islands were covered by water, and 6 more have experienced severe erosion into the sea. And so we can see some housing structures in this picture being surrounded by water as it's coming in. And then these houses here are completely surrounded. They can't move those houses inland. There's nowhere to go. So eventually this little piece of land, which has a very low elevation above sea level, is going to be covered. Particularly if you just have any big waves come through, that population is going to be very vulnerable to any of those weather events. So one island, Nuatambu, has already lost 20 homes, and there's more information on this link that I'll post in the comments. In Louisiana, the town of Ile de Jean Charles has lost 98% of its land since 1955. So you can watch these changing pictures up here on the top from 1971 to the current day, and those dark areas are areas that are covered by water. The picture on the bottom is what it looks like now. It's mostly just a strip of land around the road. All of the land around that has been covered by water. So that town is actually being relocated. It won a grant competition, and there's a lot of other small towns that applied for that grant that didn't get it, that don't really have any other options, and I'll also put this link in the comments. So in addition to all of this, this loss of food sources, this loss of productive places to live, we are also going to be adding more people to our population. It's projected that we might add 2 billion more people. So where are those people going to go? What are they going to eat? What resources will they have? What countries are they being born into? And will they have to be climate refugees? And will the countries around them accept them? So all of this is disproportionately falling on the shoulders of poor communities and people of color. And often, particularly with poor communities, right, they are not contributing as strongly to climate change as rich communities are. They are not using as many resources, they're not producing as much CO2, and yet the impacts of that will be more strongly experienced by those communities. So I don't know if you got warm during this presentation. I got warm, had to take my coat off, got real red in the face, but maybe it was those warming colors. But we can cool down now, right? We can think about how we will deal with these coming changes. It's a lot.